affects the autonomy of states to set up their own taxation systems. Now, again, obviously, there is a conflict between autonomy as such as well and efficiency. Now, within the Finance Commission, for example, this was recognized very strongly on the revenue side, but not that clearly on the expenditure side. And my worry on the GST is that it probably needed an input from the states, and that would have got rid of much of the opposition you're currently seeing in Parliament, where the states' GST councils could be, the GST council set up by the state finance ministers had much more clout and could actually agree. You would have got something. Yes, it may have been better. I mean, the states might have been able to bargain more for themselves. But I think, on the whole, that's an institution which somehow seems to have been taken for granted in the process going through. And we are at the moment, that wouldn't have been a problem. But there are a huge number of things like pollution, which are local problems, which are problems where there is a very strong case for actually having certain types of taxes somewhere or not. And exactly the same thing, of course, happens on the expenditure side. On the expenditure side, for example, I think where the Finance Commission did err, and that's the only one area I think it erred, and it erred fairly hugely in that. It doesn't affect too many states, not the big ones anyway. But that is in the following. The way it went about this whole thing about special category states was driven by something very, very political. In the year leading up to the Finance Commission, we had the case of Nitish Kumar in Bihar jumping for Bihar becoming a special category state. And even worse, you had Andhra Pradesh, which had been divided, and Andhra Pradesh was jumping for special category awards. Now, given this, I think what happened is that we all got convinced that the special category bug is too virulent a one to allow to exist. So let's get rid of it. But the fact is that the special categories that you had, other than the two Himalayan states, that is Himachal and Uttaranchal, were really creations almost at the point of the creation of the Constitution. That is, they were issues to do with becoming a part of India itself, either Kashmir or most of what was Assam. And you had very special things there which had nothing to do with economics. Instead of saying that directly, we got into all sorts of things with the, the Rajan report on certain states being worse off. Why don't we replace that by... So I think we got into this economic argument which had nothing to do with it. But one of the things that left historically was the following, which is that these special category states, which had their own problems because they're at the periphery of India. They were border states with clear political problems within those states. And over time, these states got used to A, fairly large capital expenditures, B, almost all that capital expenditure being borne by the central government. Very little being done by themselves. Now, what you got here was, and in any case, they didn't get much devolution. They got a little bit from the center. They got a little bit from the Finance Commission as revenue deficit grants, but they got large amounts in terms of central transfers, mainly through the things that Sindhu talked about, the normal central assistance and various other things which went with that. The Finance Commission got rid of all of these And it did not include the capital expenditure in calculating their revenue deficit grants. Several of them are going to be in trouble. Now, why is, again, that's not a problem by itself. What it is a problem is that it is a window to another type of discretion. These will be made up, I'm sure. But they will be made up in ways which are discretionary. And we have already seen that in terms of before an election, where the outcome isn't certain, in the states first of Jammu and Kashmir and then of Bihar, of huge, unheard of special packages. I mean, you've already seen that. I mean, the size of those special packages outdoes anything that happened ever before. And they're bound to come. But if they are bound to come, they must also mean that the way the center spends its money will have to be curtailed somewhere else, given the same fiscal deficit. And I think it introduces an uncertainty into the central's planning, which at least the Planning Commission, at least with its teeth when it had it, and when it was something which was separate from the Ministry of Finance, and could actually bring certain issues to cabinet, also not directly to the cabinet, but indirectly through the Prime Minister himself, was in a position to say that, look here, looking forward, these are things which you must balance. And one of the things to balance is discretion now as against an objective laid out for a 5 or 6 year period. And I think that's where the real issue or the real question mark is over the next 3 or 4 years till we know whether there's a 13th plan at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sen. And let me thank Professor Sarkar again for coming here.
I have to catch a flight.
He came in just for the panel.
Why don't you take a few questions and then go?
Okay. I'll just take one or two. If there is at all one.
Yeah, so if there are questions, particularly those directed at Professor Sarkar.
I don't think there is. Oh, okay.
All right, yes.
I was just surprised that the whole, by your argument, sense that since the whole idea of devolution was that expenditure should be the tax revenue should be devolved to the places where expenditure takes place, that you don't have greater faith in state governments. And I have no position on this, but I thought that you might have some sympathy for it.
Yeah, well, actually we yes, firstly, we did some rigorous field work, Pranabda, Dilip, Sandip and myself. And we found out that money is not always, well spent. Money goes to the wrong places. So it's better sometimes to have broad schemes. That's my personal feeling, National Health Mission is not such a bad thing after all, and if you know that you have to spend some money there, you have to spend it. You cannot, give out doles and things like that. I'm not talking about West Bengal in particular. I think that should be true for all states. So, if you think that the party in power is rational in the sense we use the term in economics, that is, sort of it has its own objective function of maximizing the probability of winning in an election, then there is no reason why money cannot be misallocated.
Anybody else was a question? Yeah, Chetan.
Yeah.
On the GST, is it your sense that all the economic aspects have been kind of agreed on more or less, and therefore what is really the opposition now is political? And once that gets solved,
There could be some political oppositions, that is possible, but even there are economic, points to be raised, like Abhijit said. It definitely has to do something with the autonomy. You have to decide what to tax and what not to tax and how much to tax. If you want that autonomy, then GST is not the right kind of thing. See, I don't know if it's the right analogy. If you think of the European Union, for example, they are at different stages of development, right? And now they have a single system of taxes and so on, and that is not always giving the best result. It is perfectly possible that a state or a region or a country which is sort of backward would have a different kind of fiscal policy than some other state. So yes, efficiency, I can see that. I mean, certainly efficiency is a point, but autonomy is another point. I completely agree with him, with Abhijit, that it's there is a trade-off. There is certainly a trade-off. But then one thing I should mention, GST might bring an end to tax competitions, for example. That is a good thing. Tax competition or incentives, or you give incentives in all sorts of ways to attract investment. To get investment is fine, but to get into a competition, that could be inefficient.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. Yeah. Can we have questions for the other panelists?
I have a question. Any of the panel can answer it. Yeah, I have a question. Anybody on the panel can answer it. My question is regarding competitive federalism, which is being observed recently, that states are fighting for to get more funds. So if we have such a thing as a discretionary budget, don't you think that this competitive federalism, when there is competition which is being invested in, say, a lot of, I'm from AP, I'm from Telangana actually, so there's this entire competition in when it comes to IT, right? So they're investing a lot on that and pretty well in that phase. So my question is that is having a discretionary budget good to encourage competitive federalism that can actually bring about some changes?
Anybody else? Any other question? Yeah, we'll collect 2-3 questions and then. Take the mic.
Thank you. I would like to understand the 1% compensation part of the GST to the manufacturing states, because it seems that it's the net consuming states would gain. So this is one of the aspects in which the state's concern is addressed. The other being that for the first 3 or 5 years they would become compensated for all the losses. So, thank you.
Just behind you. You wanted to ask?
My question was about the more of a local development issue, that with increased devolution, what impact does it have at the local level? There's not much devolution for the states to give out to the cities. Cities are still depend upon national budgets, such as the projects like JNNURM. Bigger projects at the urban level they still depend, and there's not much devolution happening from the state. So is there any capacity building happening at that level also, further devolution?
Anybody else? Any questions? We'll take these three and then. No more questions? Yeah.
Yeah, it's about the discretion and damage to the national economy, and if discretion is not being implemented in agreement, so that what Professor Sen said about the enforcement and force is applied to implement the discretion. So how means in the past this discretion and enforcement damage the economy, the state economy and the national economy. So yeah, that.
Abhirup.
Yeah, so this is for anyone in the panel. So I wonder, so with this mix of central schemes and state schemes and various things, one wonders what is the attribution that people give. I mean, so do people think money comes from the center, because this is important to the political economy and how the voters in some sense hold their politicians responsible. So insofar as a decisive step is made in terms of giving state the autonomy, it probably means that over time the voters would actually see all their outcomes as a result of decisions made by a particular, by the state politicians, which may actually increase accountability. I mean, Abhirup said, there are all these misallocations and stuff, but, I have studied many funds like NREGs and stuff like that, and it's not very clear who people attribute these implementation to.
I think we'll, yeah, so.
I'll not address the GST question. I think one of the others can take that. On the issue of competitive federalism, on the attribution and on the urban, competitive federalism is a new buzzword currently. What I would say is that earlier the discretionary transfers, which earlier I meant the planned transfers, which were under specific heads or under specific programs in the centrally sponsored schemes. My observation is that most of them were predicated on how, quote unquote, backward you were, meaning how much lower were you as compared to the national average, which even the Finance Commission has kept as one of that, what they call income distance. But it could be that Bihar or UP would get more funds under the health mission or under the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan because A, they had larger populations, and B, they had more to cover on the grounds of getting children into school or whatever. Now, at least the emphasis seems to be to incentivize states to perform in areas where they think they have an advantage. So the point that you made about IT investments and competitive investments in general, you're seeing a sort of spate of state investor conferences, global summits. So there is an attempt to attract investments, not necessarily into the development programs, but into investing in the state so that the state grows better. So that is a development which is worth watching, because whether there would be a competition for doing better, and then what earlier also used to be called to keep some component of these development programs as performance grants. It's nothing new, it's been argued a lot, but ultimately the transfers used to be, even though they were discretionary in the sense that they were not Finance Commission transfers, there were certain norms or rules which governed how much any state would get. So to that extent, it was not possible to give more to, let's say, Arunachal Pradesh and less to Bihar. It was not possible. It still probably may not be, but there is always a possibility now going forward to keep this in mind, that if you do well, find a way of rewarding the state that does better, especially in programs which require a huge amount of consistent implementation effort. On the local body issue, the Finance Commission local body grants are both to Gram Panchayats and to Nagarpalika Parishads. So to that extent, many state governments are now saying that these bodies are going to be richer to perform whatever functions they can perform than they ever were. Some estimates put it as over what 200 to 500% of what was going in the 13th under the 13th Finance Commission. But large urban programs are still being pushed, but in a very different design. That is the Urban Rejuvenation Mission, the successor to the JNURM, or the Smart Cities, which is a baby of that rejuvenation mission. The design is very different. The design is that you come up with your plan and we will fund you. And then there is some sort of internal competition within the state and then between the states to select which of your cities qualifies to be, which of your rejuvenation cities qualifies to be a smart city. So to that extent, the principle which was just earlier mentioned as cooperative federalism is being taken into account in the design of these central programs. But as I said, the scale and the amount of funding required or resources required may not be forthcoming if this principle of rule-bound transfers is carried to its final and very clear conclusion that the center should do its business and keep to roads and railways and ports and not get into state list or concurrent list subjects. I mean, that is something which I don't think should happen, because I don't think the political economy of this country can withstand an agglomeration of 29 states and union territories. It's not possible. You need a center to hold it together. Now, on the attribution, by and large, the attribution is to the local government. We have seen that many programs even get renamed. I mean, even if the amounts are going through the central government, ultimately it's the Mukhyamantri Yojana that gets the visibility. So to that extent, I think the central government and the planning commission or whoever, the ministries who were disbursing, were quite resigned to it, except that it was uniform across all the states. It still is. These national programs under centrally sponsored schemes have a uniform pattern. But people's attribution will always be to whoever brings the money to them. So it depends on the persona or the charisma of the local leadership. Mostly we find it's the chief minister.
Thank you. And yeah, 1% tax, it's not one, yeah, sort of a compensation. It's not, we have a central sales tax. The idea is when you have a seamless market, you are talking about common market, there should not be taxes based on origin, that means based on production location. So the manufacturing states are saying that since it's a consumption tax, it will be taxed at the based on destination principle. That means at the point of consumption, it will be taxed, so we will be the loser. So they are saying that you put a tax on goods manufactured, at a supply of goods manufactured, not the services, only goods at 1%, so that will protect their revenue, and they will have a relook later. Now that is continuing the origin-based tax system in a destination-based tax that we are trying to propose. So the design gets, complicated and inefficient. So, but they have said that in the bill that they will relook it after 2 years and then it might go. So that is where it stands. But then the other argument is, if I am giving 100% compensation for 5 years, why do we need a 1% tax on the supply of goods? And that is one of the major issues why the bill is also stuck. So that is where it stands. And on the local level, I'll just, this is, I think I don't have answer to all the questions, and I think previous speaker has already addressed those questions. So I'll just try to address this issue of, you said about the urban finances and the local level tax devolution. I think the local level, the transfers have increased by almost 300% because it was 89,000 crore, now it is almost 3 lakh crores. So all the local bodies will get more resources. But I think the question of homogeneity in terms of taxes, it has got a lot to do with the GST. Because once the GST comes, the taxes, local taxes will be subsumed in GST. And this is a major issue where there are large urban local bodies, because the states are saying if the octroi goes, how do we manage our local finances? So some of the arguments, if you look at literature on taxes, they say that you can piggyback on GST. So 1% taxes extra go to the local bodies. So I think once GST comes, how these local taxes get subsumed in the design, which is still not very clear, would give an idea what kind of impact it would have on the finances of the local bodies.
Well, I think most of the questions have been addressed. Let me just run through some of them. The last one, which was the one Pinaki just talked about, I think the problem that he just mentioned is probably going to be bigger than most people realize, which is that a lot of the large urban local bodies do depend upon tax devolutions or special types of taxes to run them, which would have to go with the GST. So at the moment, the states are funding them by giving them either access to some taxes which they collect and then share, or are there specifically for the purposes of those local authorities. And clearly, the Finance Commission award would have to balance all of that. And I mean, state by state, they would have to actually look at it. I mean, that's an exercise yet to be done. And that is something which, all that I'm saying is probably something on which less work has been done than ought to be. Attribution. You see, your argument is absolutely right. I mean, if you have attribution, you at least have the incentive to deliver, okay? On the other hand, attribution is precisely was Abhirup's problem, the other Abhirup's problem, which is that if you have attribution, then you attribute it where it gives you the most political mileage. And certain parts you don't need attribution if you are sure of winning an election or sure of losing it. Now, I think we had actually a situation in which we had programs, as Sindhu said, where there were guidelines. So you could do certain things, you couldn't do other things. Yes, that led to one size fits all, but increasingly most of this had become formula linked with much greater discretion to the states. And as a result, what you had at the end of the day was some rules of how to spend, some allocations to particular areas, as well as the fact that the states could actually attribute it to their own Mukhyamantri programs. So in a sense, you might have got a lot of the best of the all worlds, not all of it. And I think that also is this thing about direction, discretion, and things. See, one of the things I've noticed, I mean, in my 10 years in the Planning Commission, was there are certain things states don't do or don't like to look into too much. Health is one of them. The big one is health. Very few chief ministers actually talk about the health system. It's a state subject. There is something which goes on, but we've let our health system actually just deteriorate beyond anything. And I am really scared about that. Education will finally take care of it. There's a lobby in education which is big. On health, other than those driven in the hospital system, there is no lobby. There's a big lobby for tertiary health, but very little for anything which is beyond, below that. Now, there is a problem here. Whatever used to go from the government of India, it is in fact in health that you see huge scams and things also happening. But what is the mean between something which the government of India is trying to push, which ought to be in the, it's clearly in the, constitutionally is in the state's domain, and the states don't have any political incentive to actually design a proper system. And in any case, health is one of those things where standards at least should be national. I think, that's another area which, if Sindhu continued, I think the NITI Aayog should really be thinking about it. But NITI Aayog is, I think, thinking less about health than almost anything else at the moment. And finally, this thing about competitive federalism. I think the other Abhirup, when he went off, did say that, there are good things to competition and there are bad things to competition. One of the things which is, as he pointed out, is that if you start cutting tax rates to attract investors, that finally is, isn't going to work very well. And on the other hand, as Sindhu pointed out, there is this